All right, we've been discussing the origins of COVID on this program, talking about that earlier, because discovering the truth is important and it's necessary. But it also provides a unique lens to consider the legacy media and their coverage, not just on COVID, but on many stories where, frankly, they get it wrong. In fact, this program has been flagged for stating various facts and opinions. This covers everything from mask mandates to whether a man can get pregnant. Yet one of the primary sources of misinformation comes from online self-described fact checkers. Well, Ben Johnson recently published a terrific piece detailing how legacy media's approach to fact-checking distorts the truth when not telling outright lies. And I encourage you to read it. You can go to WashingtonStand.com or go to TonyPerkins.com, follow the links over at Washington Stand. Great source of information. Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is Ben Johnson, senior reporter and editor at the Washington Stand. Ben, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you so much, Tony.
All right, so this issue of the fact checkers, and we really launched this in being looking at this more in depth, is the fact that so many people were flagged for linking the coronavirus to the Wuhan lab, and now we know the Department of Energy, the FBI, saying that's the case. So where do these fact checkers get off thinking they are the only source and labeling anyone else that has a competing or a contrary idea as being a conspiracy theorist?
Well, most of it comes from either Facebook or the FBI. The federal government itself as well had a backdoor into Twitter where they could flag certain accounts or posts, and they either wanted those posts taken down or the accounts completely banned, or at least de-emphasized and shadow banned if they said something that violated Dr. Fauci's most recent dictates. So that was true throughout the pandemic. And you see this constant changing, like a party line in the old Soviet days. The best example was Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post. Kessler at one point actually chided Senator Ted Cruz about the origins of the virus. Ted Cruz had said this may have come from China, and he said it was, quote unquote, impossible. A few months into the Biden administration, suddenly the narrative changed. He wrote a piece titled, quote, "How the Wuhan lab theory suddenly became credible." And the information that he was citing dated all the way back to July of 2020. Ultimately, there were reporters with NBC and the New York Times who let the cat out of the bag. They said, we didn't believe it because Mike Pompeo told us, and he's connected to President Donald Trump.
So just because it was conservative, they automatically dismissed it outright?
That's exactly right. And they admitted as much. They said we couldn't trust the Trump administration. And ultimately, they went back to the same underlying data that the Trump administration used.
But Ben, it's not just the Wuhan lab and the coronavirus that the fact checkers have been wrong on. We saw, and you detail this in your piece, it's a quite lengthy piece, and you go through several examples, although not totally exhaustive because the list is too long. But Senator Rand Paul, YouTube suspended him because he said that most of the masks that you get over the counter don't work. They don't prevent infection. Have we not just recently seen a mega study that shows that in fact masks don't work?
Well, we've seen that, and in fact, the CDC has admitted as much. Rochelle Walensky came out and said these cloth masks are no longer mandatory, and in fact, they won't do what they needed to do, which is what Dr. Fauci said at the beginning of the pandemic. He said that masks would not be very helpful. And later on, he said he changed his tune because he was trying to make sure that that material was available, PPE was available for people who were in the medical healing industries. So he more or less admitted he was the source of disinformation on that one. But we've had studies that have verified this well before the pandemic. In 2015, there was a British Medical Journal study which found, and I quote, that cloth masks present 0% filtration of viruses and may result in increased risk of infection. So wearing a cloth mask may be worse than doing nothing. The CDC actually later on cited a study where they said you should use masks. And when I read the underlying study, it said that cloth masks may reduce the transmission of viruses 17%, or they may increase the transmission of viruses 17%. That was the information they were using to promote their mask mandates.
And the list goes on. You have the Hunter Biden laptop, Obamacare, Planned Parenthood. I mean, the list just goes on and on. But let me ask you, what happens when they label something as being disinformation, the fact checkers say this is false or partially true? What happens to those individuals and their ability to communicate?
Well, for that post, we know, according to Facebook, they reduce about 80% of its visibility. So instead of a complete ban, you only get to reach about 1 in 5 of people who would have seen it and who in fact followed you specifically so they could follow your feed. They want the information that you bring. For example, like the Washington Stand and FRC, we bring a perspective you don't find anywhere else, certainly not NBC or New York Times. So they follow specifically for this information, and yet they are essentially censored from sharing it with a vast lion's share of their audience.
So this has an effect. I mean, this is significant when they are the umpires, if you will, of what is true and what is not. And we've seen it's not just one example, it's multiple examples of where they are absolutely wrong. Would it not be a better approach, Ben, to let people have a conversation and let individuals determine whether or not this source or that source is credible?
Well, that's certainly what Thomas Jefferson thought, one of the, of course, founding fathers. He believed that ultimately everyone should have a voice and the truth will out. The American people are wise enough, intelligent enough that if you allow all perspectives to be heard, people will eventually understand which one is true and which one is false. So that's very much an American perspective. It's the founding perspective, and it should be the very basis of our rational discourse. Our debate. We understand that people have been gifted by God with rationality. They can sort through claims, and ultimately they are all adults. They have the ability to come to their own conclusions.
That's not the perspective of the left. Ben Johnson, what are you working on at the stand today that people might want to take a look at?
Well, in part, I'm going to be talking about some introduction of legislation to change the trade status for China, to revoke its most favored nation status trade policies, which have gone back all the way back into the 1980s. And in fact, China just announced that it's going to increase its military budget once again by about 7%. We think they're getting the money.
Wow. All right, Ben Johnson, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Great piece on the fact checkers.